Hello everyone, and thank you for clicking on this video. Are you having trouble falling asleep? You're in the right place. The Scary Nightmare is here to help you find peace before bed. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any updates that will help you relax. Now, lie down comfortably, take a deep breath, and let go of any tension. The story is about to begin. Story 1. I never thought that an old crumbling house in the middle of nowhere would hold such a dark and twisted secret. But then again, when I arrived there, I didn't know what awaited me. It was a late autumn evening when I first drove past the house. The trees surrounding it were bare, their skeletal branches reaching into the sky like hands desperate to grasp at something unseen. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky tinged with hues of purple and deep blue. My headlights flickered as I steered the car down the long, winding road. There was no one else for miles. I had come to this town for a reason. I was looking for something that I could never quite name. Perhaps it was escape, or perhaps it was something far darker, a thirst I couldn't explain. But that house, it caught my attention. At first, I passed it by, but then something pulled at me to turn around. I parked the car at the foot of a long gravel path that led up to the house. The gate creaked as the wind blew through it, the sound as eerie as the atmosphere surrounding the place. I stood there for a moment, hesitating, feeling a strange pull from within, urging me to move closer. The house was ancient. It looked abandoned, its windows boarded up, the porch sagging in places as though it had been neglected for years. Yet, there was something about it that didn't feel entirely empty. It was as if it had been waiting for me, anticipating my arrival. I approached the house cautiously, every step echoing in the stillness. The wind whispered through the trees, and the air grew colder with every inch I moved toward the door. The closer I got, the more unsettling the house became. It wasn't just the decay that gave off a sense of dread. It was the silence. There were no birds, no insects, no signs of life whatsoever, only the whispering wind. When I reached the door, it creaked open on its own, as though it had been expecting me. The smell of mildew and stale air hit me like a wave as I stepped inside. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, and the darkness inside seemed to envelope me. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my breath visible in the cold air. I took out my flashlight and began exploring the house, one room at a time. Each one was more decayed than the last. Dust covered everything, and the air was thick with the scent of old wood and rotting fabric. It was clear that no one had lived here in a long time, but still, there was a strange energy in the air, a feeling that I wasn't alone. As I made my way through the hallways, I found a staircase leading to the second floor. Hesitant but curious, I ascended, each step creaking under my weight. The second floor was much darker than the first, and the air felt even heavier, as though the very walls were pressing in on me. There was a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, and beyond it, I could see faint light flickering. I moved closer, drawn by that light. When I opened the door, I was met by the sight of a room unlike the others. It was not decayed or ruined. In fact, it appeared to be in perfect condition, as though it had been untouched for years. A bed, a dresser, and a small desk were arranged neatly, and a soft, golden light filled the room. The air here felt warmer, more inviting, but also wrong. There was something off about it, something I couldn't quite place. My eyes were drawn to the bed, and that's when I noticed it. A small porcelain doll lying on the pillow. It was unlike any doll I had ever seen before. Its eyes were hollow, its face pale and smooth. The detail in the craftsmanship was unsettling, the kind of detail that suggested it wasn't merely a toy but something far more sinister. I stepped into the room, my heart racing. I reached out to touch the doll, and as my fingers brushed its cool surface, a chill ran down my spine. The air around me seemed to shift, and for the first time since I entered the house, I felt the presence of something otherworldly. Something watching me. I pulled my hand back, But it was too late. The temperature dropped even further, and I heard the unmistakable sound of whispering, soft and guttural, coming from the walls. It was as though the house itself was alive, whispering secrets that no living person was meant to hear. I turned and fled from the room, but the whispers followed me, echoing in my ears louder and louder until I thought I might go mad. I ran down the stairs and out of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I stumbled to my car and slammed the door shut behind me, the engine roaring to life as I sped down the gravel road. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that the house and its secrets weren't done with me. Days passed, but I couldn't forget what I had felt. The whispers still echoed in my mind, and I found myself drawn back to that place. I had to know more. What had happened in that house? What had I uncovered? I tried to ignore it, but the pull was too strong. A week later, I found myself driving back to that same house, unable to resist the strange allure it had on me. The wind had picked up, and the sky had turned gray with storm clouds. When I arrived, the house stood just as it had before, but this time I wasn't alone. There were others there, their faces obscured by shadow, watching me from the windows. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I knew one thing. I was no longer just a visitor. I was a part of whatever dark force had claimed that house, a force that had existed long before I had ever set foot there. I entered the house once more, this time not as an outsider but as something else. Something bound to the house, to the curse that had begun all those years ago. The whispers grew louder, and I knew, deep down, that I was never going to leave. The house had claimed me, and now I was part of its dark history. Story 2. I didn't believe in ghosts. I never did. To me, they were just stories people told around campfires or the exaggerated tales spun in the halls of old, forgotten houses. But that was before I moved to the small town of Ashford. Before the events that led me to question everything I knew about the world. The house I rented was not much, just a modest two-story building on the outskirts of town. It was old, perhaps a century or more, but it was still standing strong, albeit with the usual signs of wear and tear. The wood creaked beneath my feet, and the walls held the faint scent of mildew, a smell that would occasionally remind me that the house had seen many years pass by. But, for the most part, it felt like a safe haven, a place where I could get away from the noise and bustle of the city life I had grown tired of. The town itself was small and quiet, its streets lined with cobblestone and overgrown ivy. There weren't many people, and the ones who did live there seemed content with the solitude. But it wasn't long before I started to notice something unusual. It began on the first night. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a sound. It was faint at first, a soft scraping noise that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the house settling. After all, houses this old had their quirks. But as the night wore on, the sound grew louder, more distinct, as if something, or someone, was moving around underneath the house. I got up to check, but there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next few days passed uneventfully, but the noise persisted. Every night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I'd hear the same scraping, and sometimes I'd hear the soft, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps in the hall outside my door. Again, I'd find nothing when I looked, but the unsettling feeling of being watched never left me. Then came the night when I woke to find something that made my heart race. It was a cold, moonless evening, and I had just begun to settle into bed when I noticed it. There, in the corner of the room, stood a shadow. It was tall and thin, and it seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but when I opened my eyes again, the shadow was gone. But I could feel it. The air grew colder, and the familiar sense of being watched intensified. I lay frozen under the covers, staring into the darkness. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of what was happening. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of my imagination? Or was something truly there? Something that didn't belong? The days that followed were filled with an unease I couldn't shake. I started to avoid the darker corners of the house, convinced that whatever was there would be waiting for me. I didn't know what I was afraid of, but I knew that I had to stay vigilant. It was on the fourth night, when I returned home late from town, that I saw it. The shadow was back, but this time, it was more than just a fleeting glimpse. This time, it moved. I had left the front door ajar in my haste to get inside, and as I entered, I saw it clearly. A dark figure standing by the stairs, just outside the hallway that led to my bedroom. It was tall, too tall to be human, and its form seemed to flicker and waver, as if it were made of smoke or some intangible substance. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to run, to leave the house and never look back, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the shadow that seemed to be studying me with an intelligence I could almost feel. Then, without warning, it moved again, slipping silently into the hallway and disappearing into the dark. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound came from my lips. My legs felt like lead, and the only thing I could do was turn and run to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake in bed, listening to the sounds of the house, the creaking of the floorboards, the occasional groan of the walls, and most disturbingly, the whispering wind that seemed to come from nowhere. It felt as though the house itself was alive, and it was trying to tell me something. The next morning, I went to town to try and clear my head. I needed to speak to someone, to make sense of what had been happening, but when I asked around, I found that no one knew anything about the house, and no one seemed to care. They told me that people came and went in Ashford, that the town had seen its share of strange occurrences over the years, but they all dismissed it with a shrug. When I returned to the house that evening, I was no longer the same. The shadow had changed something in me. I could feel it, deep within my bones. The way the air pressed against my skin, the way the house seemed to hum with energy, as if something ancient had awakened. And then, the dreams started. At first, they were faint, like flashes of memories I couldn't quite place. I would see the house as it had been long before I moved in, its rooms filled with light and laughter. But then, something would change. The laughter would turn to screams, the light would fade, and I'd see figures, moving in the darkness, their eyes staring at me with an emptiness that chilled me to the core. With each passing night, the dreams grew more vivid, more real. The figures would come closer, until I could feel their cold breath on my skin, their hands brushing against my face. And all the while, the shadow in the corner of the room would grow taller, stretching across the walls, until it consumed the entire room. I tried to leave. I packed my bags and went to the car, but every time I turned the key in the ignition, something would stop me. I couldn't leave. The house had a hold on me, and the longer I stayed, the tighter its grip became. I would drive for miles, but no matter where I went, I always ended up back at that house. One evening, after a particularly restless night, I decided to search the house, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain the strange occurrences. I made my way into the basement, a place I had avoided since I moved in. The stairs creaked as I descended, and the air grew thick with dust. It was cold down there, colder than the rest of the house, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. In the far corner, behind a stack of old boxes, I found something. It was a small, wooden chest, its surface covered in strange carvings. The chest was old, even older than the house itself, and when I opened it, I found a bundle of old papers. They were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but as I read, a chill ran through me. The papers told the story of the house, of the people who had lived there long before I did. They spoke of rituals, dark rituals meant to summon things from beyond the veil. The house had been built on land that had once been sacred, a place where the living and the dead intersected. And the rituals had worked. The house had become a gateway, a place where spirits could pass through, where shadows could take form. And the shadow that had been following me? It was no ghost, no mere apparition. It was a being, a thing that had been summoned centuries ago, bound to the house and to anyone who dared to live there. I never left. The shadow took me in, just as it had taken the others before me. And now, I walked the halls of the house, a silent witness to the endless cycle of terror that it brings to those who come. The wind whispers through the trees, the shadows flicker and stretch, and I am no longer sure where the house ends and I begin. Story 3. When I arrived in the small, forgotten village of Black Hollow, I didn't know that I was about to step into a web of mystery that would alter my perception of reality. The village, hidden deep within a remote valley, seemed like the kind of place where time stood still. The streets were narrow, and the houses were built close together, their windows often shuttered as if the villagers wanted to hide from something. It was late in the afternoon when I arrived, the sun casting long, muted shadows across the cobblestones. I had come to Black Hollow to escape the noise of the city, to find a place where I could be alone with my thoughts. The innkeeper greeted me with a nod and a half-smile as he handed me a key to a room on the second floor. I didn't ask many questions. There was no need to. The village was quiet, serene even, but there was something in the air that made me uneasy, a quiet tension that I couldn't explain. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. A faint, distant sound, almost like the rustling of paper or the brushing of something soft against the walls. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the usual sounds of an old house settling. This was different. The noise came from somewhere deeper, like it was coming from within the building itself. I strained my ears, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. The next day, I decided to explore the village. The streets were quiet, but not in a way that felt peaceful. It was more like the calm before a storm, the kind of stillness that fills you with an unshakable sense of dread. The villagers went about their daily routines, but their eyes never met mine. It was as if they were all caught in some unspoken agreement to avoid interaction. I wandered through the village for hours, hoping to shake the strange feeling that clung to me. As the sun began to set, I found myself at the edge of a thick, dark forest. The trees were tall and gnarled, their branches twisted like claws reaching into the sky. The path that led into the forest was overgrown with moss, and the air felt colder as I stepped onto it. Something about the place felt wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. There was an odd pull, a compulsion to keep walking deeper into the woods. The further I went, the quieter it became. The birds fell silent, and the wind ceased its gentle rustling. It felt as though the very forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stumbled upon a clearing, and in the center of it stood a small stone structure, its walls crumbling with age. There were no windows, only a door that seemed to have been hastily constructed. The door was ajar, but I didn't go inside. I stood there, staring at the stone building, feeling the weight of its presence. There was something about it that made my skin crawl. I turned back, but the forest felt different now. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. I felt as though I wasn't alone. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know something is watching you, even if you can't see it. I quickened my pace, and just as I was about to leave the woods, I heard it again, the rustling sound. Only this time, it was closer, much closer. I broke into a run, not daring to look behind me. My heart raced, and my breath came in short gasps as I raced back toward the village. I didn't stop until I reached the inn, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The innkeeper gave me a look when I returned, but he said nothing. I didn't mention the forest or the strange noises. I couldn't bring myself to speak about it. It felt too real, too dangerous. That night, I locked the door to my room and pulled the curtains shut, but sleep wouldn't come. The room was cold, and the bed felt too large, as though I were lying in the center of an empty space. I kept hearing the same rustling, only now it was louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from outside my window. I didn't dare look. Instead, I huddled under the covers, trying to ignore the sound, hoping it would go away. But it didn't. I woke to the feeling of something standing at the foot of my bed. A presence, heavy and oppressive. My heart thudded in my chest as I lay there, paralyzed by fear. The room was pitch black, the only sound the thundering of my own heartbeat. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, as if from nowhere, I heard it. The softest whisper, too faint to understand, but it was there. I don't know how long I lay there, trapped in that silent terror. The air grew colder still, and the darkness seemed to press in on me. Finally, I forced myself to move, throwing the covers off and rushing to the door. I didn't care about anything except escaping the room. But when I reached for the door, it wouldn't open. The handle was cold, like ice, and no matter how hard I twisted, the door remained shut. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. It was coming from all directions now, as if the walls themselves were speaking to me. I backed away from the door, my mind racing for a way out. The room was shrinking, the walls closing in, and the temperature continued to drop. I could see my breath now, hanging in the air like smoke. My eyes were wide, and I could hear my pulse ringing in my ears. And then, I saw it. The shadow. It was standing in the corner of the room, its form indistinct but somehow there. It was tall, dark, and formless, a presence that filled the space. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, an intense, suffocating stare that seemed to pierce through the very core of me. The whispering grew louder, more chaotic, as though the shadow itself was speaking, calling out to me. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was tight, as if something was choking me from the inside. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. All I could do was stare at the shadow, helpless and terrified. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The room returned to normal, the door was unlocked, and the whispers faded into silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. But finally, I gathered the courage to open the door and step into the hallway. The inn was silent. The air was still. I could hear the faint sounds of wind outside, but inside, it was as though the building itself had been holding its breath. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The events of the evening had shaken me to my core. I had to leave. I had to get out of Black Hollow. I left the inn early the next morning, without a word to the innkeeper or the villagers. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking, and drove away without looking back. I didn't know what had happened to me in that room, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never return to Black Hollow. And yet, even as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow had followed me, that it was still there, lurking just beyond my reach, waiting for the right moment to return. There was no escape. Story 4. The town of Blackthorn was the kind of place people passed through without ever really noticing. It was a small, unremarkable town, nestled between two hills with only a few old buildings and a sparse population. I hadn't heard of it before my arrival, but the job I'd taken offered an apartment here, and I thought it would be a good place to start fresh. I needed a change, and this town promised solitude, a calm that the bustle of the city had never provided. My apartment was a modest one, tucked above an old store at the edge of town. The wooden floors were worn from years of use, and the walls were thin, but it was quiet. The kind of quiet that permeates every corner of a place, a silence so deep that you could almost feel it pressing in on you. I enjoyed it at first, so much so that I started walking around town just to hear the sound of my footsteps. There was an odd beauty to the town. It was like it had been forgotten by time, its buildings slowly falling into disrepair, its streets not maintained. The town felt like a place frozen in memory, with no new developments, no fresh life. The townspeople were few, and most of them seemed uninterested in anything beyond their routines. I had only seen a handful of faces in the short time I had been here. and even those faces were often hidden behind drawn curtains or the shadows of doorways. I quickly learned that the town had no great history, no remarkable landmarks. The local bar was the only place where people gathered in the evenings, but even there, conversation was sparse. I preferred it that way. I wasn't interested in becoming close to anyone. One night, I returned to my apartment after a long day at work. It was late, later than usual, and the sun had already disappeared behind the hills, leaving only a faint twilight glow. As I walked up the narrow staircase to my apartment, something felt different, but I couldn't put my finger on it. There was a heaviness in the air, something almost palpable, but it was not a physical weight. It was a quiet discomfort, as if something had shifted just out of sight. I tried to brush it off. Perhaps it was just the fatigue. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and was immediately hit by an unusual smell. It wasn't strong, but it was strange. Like something old, something stale that had been left to settle in the room for far too long. It made my stomach turn. I scanned the room for the source, but everything seemed in order. My coat was still hung by the door, the furniture in its usual spots, and the windows were still closed. But the smell lingered in the air, creeping into the corners of the room. I tried to ignore it as I began my evening routine. I made myself some dinner, ate quickly, and sat down with a book. But I couldn't focus. The smell, the unsettling feeling in the air, it wouldn't leave me alone. The room seemed dimmer than usual, and the silence felt thick, almost like it was waiting for something. I went to open the window, thinking fresh air would help, but the latch was stuck. It had never been like this before. The window had always opened easily. I tried to force it, but the feeling of being watched returned. Silent, heavy, suffocating. I stopped and took a step back. The room had become unbearably still. It was as though time had stopped. The light seemed duller now, as if the room had been drained of its color. I turned back to face the apartment, my gaze moving over the shelves, the couch, the paintings on the walls. Everything was unchanged, yet nothing felt the same. It was then that I noticed the photographs. They had always been on the wall, placed haphazardly, framed in mismatched frames. At first, I hadn't paid them much attention. They were pictures of the town, faded, black and white images of people I didn't recognize. But tonight, I saw them differently. Each one of them was staring at me, not looking past me, not into the distance, but right at me. The eyes of the people in the photographs were wide, almost unnaturally so, and there was something in their expressions, something in their eyes, that made the room feel colder. I tried to shrug it off as my imagination running wild, but the unease only deepened. I left the apartment and went out for a walk, needing to clear my head. The streets were quiet as usual, the only sound the distant hum of a train passing through the valley. I walked aimlessly, my footsteps echoing against the pavement, until I found myself standing in front of the old church at the edge of town. The church had always been there, weathered and worn by years of neglect. The doors were always locked, the windows dark. It had a presence about it, something ancient, something forgotten, but I had never given it much thought before. Tonight, however, something drew me closer. The air was colder here, the sky darker, and the sound of my footsteps seemed to falter as I approached. I stood in front of the church for a long time, staring at its imposing structure. There was a sense of heaviness around it, as though it was guarding something. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard something, a faint rustling sound. It came from behind the church, from the small cemetery that lay hidden among the overgrown trees. My curiosity got the better of me, and against my better judgment, I moved toward the cemetery. The iron gate was old and rusted, but it opened easily enough. I stepped inside, feeling the crunch of dry leaves beneath my feet. The tombstones here were worn and weathered, many of them barely readable, the names and dates almost completely erased by time. I walked deeper into the cemetery, following the path between the graves until I reached the back. There, I saw something strange. A small stone structure, almost like a crypt, hidden beneath the overgrown branches of a tree. The stone was dark, and the air around it felt colder, heavier. I approached cautiously, but as I reached out to touch the surface, I felt something. A presence. It was subtle at first, like a whisper at the edge of my mind, but it grew stronger, more insistent, as though the ground itself was calling out to me. I didn't stay long. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, and as I turned to leave, the rustling behind me returned. Faint, but this time unmistakable. I hurried back to the gate, not looking behind me. I didn't want to know what was there. That night, I locked my door and tried to sleep, but the air was too thick with tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something had changed. I kept hearing the faint rustling sounds, but this time they weren't outside, they were coming from the walls. Soft scratching noises, as if something was moving inside them. I couldn't sleep, not a wink. The hours dragged on, each one filled with the low murmur of those sounds. The photographs on the wall began to haunt me again. Every time I looked at them, I saw more faces, faces that hadn't been there before. Their expressions were twisted now, distorted in ways I couldn't explain. I left the apartment early the next morning, too unsettled to stay another moment. I walked out into the streets, but the town felt different now. It was the same, yet it wasn't. The people who had once seemed so distant now felt strange, like figures caught in the wrong place or time. They passed me by, their faces unreadable, their eyes empty. The church stood in the distance, silent, imposing. I found myself walking toward it again, drawn by the same pull that had brought me here the night before. This time, the door to the church was slightly ajar, as though waiting for me. I stepped inside without hesitation, the air colder and more oppressive than I had ever felt before. The church was darker than I remembered, the shadows cast by the stained glass windows stretching across the stone floor. It was silent, save for the faint rustling sound that seemed to come from every corner of the room. I approached the altar, and there, in the center of the room, I saw something. Something that hadn't been there before. It was a figure, a shape that seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves. It was tall, its features indistinct, but its presence was unmistakable. It was standing there, watching me, and in that moment, I knew it wasn't a person. It was something ancient, something that had always been here, and I was never meant to leave. Story 5. The village of Greybrook was one of those places that felt as though it had been frozen in time, a place where everything moved at a slow, deliberate pace. It wasn't the kind of place that would catch your attention unless you had a reason to be there. Most travelers who passed through only did so because they were either lost or had business further up the road. For me, it was the latter. I had taken a job in a nearby town, and the commute was long enough that I needed somewhere to stay in between. I had arrived on a Friday afternoon, the sun still high in the sky but beginning to dip into the horizon. The village, like many rural places, was quiet, and its charm lay in its simplicity. The buildings were old but well maintained, each one painted in faded colors, their wooden shutters closed against the outside world. I found a small bed and breakfast near the town square and decided to settle in for the weekend. The owner, a woman named Mrs. Bennet, was kind enough to show me to my room and offer a quiet dinner of bread and soup before I turned in for the night. The room was small but cozy, with a single bed, a chair, and a small desk by the window. The bed creaked slightly as I lay down, and the window offered a view of the street below, where the last few villagers were finishing their evening routines. The silence in the room was something I hadn't experienced in a while, and I relished in it. I was exhausted from the drive, and the quiet seemed to wash over me like a balm. But it wasn't long before the quiet began to feel oppressive. It was subtle at first, a faint noise in the distance, something I couldn't quite place. A soft scratching sound, like the brush of something against the walls. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the house settling, but as the evening wore on, the noise grew more distinct. It wasn't just from the walls anymore. It was from the ceiling, from beneath the floorboards. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. I got up and checked the door, making sure it was locked. I looked out the window, but all I could see were the same few houses, their lights dimmed, the streets empty. I stepped back and tried to ignore the sound, but it lingered. It was like a slow heartbeat, soft and insistent, growing louder the longer I listened. I shook my head, convinced it was just the fatigue settling in. I returned to bed and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The sound was still there, and now it was joined by something else. A low, distant hum, almost like a lullaby, but one that had been forgotten, left to wither in time. I didn't fall asleep that night. The noise, the hum, kept me awake, and the longer I lay there, the more I felt that I was being watched. The room grew colder, and despite the blankets, I couldn't seem to get warm. I closed my eyes, hoping the night would pass quickly, but the hum remained relentless, the shadows in the room deepening with every passing minute. By morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept at all, but I had a job to get to, and I knew I couldn't afford to let the night's events interfere with my plans. I dressed quickly and went downstairs for breakfast. Mrs. Bennet greeted me with a smile, as if nothing unusual had happened. I forced a smile back, though the unease from the previous night still clung to me like a fog. The day passed uneventfully enough. I worked in the nearby town and returned to Greybrook in the evening. The village was even quieter now, the streets almost deserted. The few people I saw seemed to move in a slow, deliberate way, their faces drawn and tired. I couldn't help but notice how empty the town felt. There was no laughter, no chatter, only the steady, rhythmic sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak of a door opening or closing. I returned to the bed and breakfast, and once again, the quiet of the room seemed oppressive. Mrs. Bennet was nowhere to be found, and the house felt empty. I settled into bed, but before I could close my eyes, the sounds returned. The scratching, the faint hum, all of it, picking up right where it had left off. This time, it was different. The hum was louder, closer, and it felt as though it was coming from beneath the floor. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I bent down to the floor, pressing my ear against the wood. The noise was coming from directly beneath me, just out of reach, like something was stirring in the depths below the house. I stood up, my mind racing. I looked around the room, trying to make sense of it. There were no obvious signs of anything amiss. The walls were solid, the furniture undisturbed, but the air felt thick, as though it were alive with something unseen, something watching from just beyond the edges of the room. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. I grabbed my coat and left the building, stepping out into the cold night air. The village was still, the streets bathed in an eerie moonlight. As I walked down the street, I passed by the town square, where a small group of villagers stood. They didn't speak to one another, only stared at the ground. Their faces were blank, and their movements slow, almost like they were in a trance. I quickened my pace, my feet carrying me toward the edge of town. There was something deeply unsettling about the way the villagers moved. It was as though they were not fully present, like their bodies were here, but their minds were elsewhere, trapped in some unspoken pattern. I reached the outskirts of the village and came to a stop in front of an old stone well. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, its surface cracked and weathered by the passage of time. I stood there for a moment, staring at the dark opening at its center. I wasn't sure why, but I felt compelled to look into it. The sound of the hum grew louder, and as I peered into the depths of the well, I could hear something else now, a faint whisper, carried on the wind, calling me to look deeper. It wasn't a voice, not a human voice, but something older, something far more ancient. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The wind picked up, rustling the trees around me, and in that moment, I felt something shift. The air grew heavier, colder. The well seemed to reach up toward me, pulling me in with an invisible force. I pulled back, gasping for breath. The air around me seemed to snap back into place, and the whispering stopped. For a brief moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then I saw something in the distance, a shadow moving through the trees. It wasn't a person, not really. It was a figure, tall and indistinct, shrouded in the darkness. It moved slowly, deliberately, toward me, its form twisting and shifting like smoke. I turned and ran back toward the village, my heart racing in my chest. The figure followed, its presence heavy in the air, but every time I looked over my shoulder, it was gone. When I reached the bed and breakfast, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. The room, the village, everything felt as though it was slowly closing in on me, trapping me in its web. I tried to sleep, but it was useless. The sounds came again, the scratching, the humming, the whispering. I felt as though the room itself was alive, as if the walls were breathing in time with the noise. The next morning, I gathered my things and left the bed and breakfast, my mind racing. I didn't know what was happening in Greybrook, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay there any longer. As I left the village behind, I glanced back at the town square. The villagers stood there, as they always did, silent and still. But this time, I noticed something else. Their eyes were watching me. Every single one of them, their gazes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I never returned to Greybrook. The road ahead seemed endless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the village had left a mark on me, that its pull would follow me no matter how far I went. And I would never forget the whispering, calling to me from the depths of the well. Story 6. It had been 3 weeks since I moved into the cottage in the quiet hills, and so far, I hadn't regretted it. It was isolated, as I had hoped, but not in a way that felt suffocating. There were no neighbors within miles, and the nearest town was a good hour's drive away, which meant I had the kind of solitude I craved. The small stone house had been abandoned for some time, and the overgrown ivy and moss-covered roof lent it an eerie charm. Still, I thought it would be a perfect place to retreat from the noise of the world and focus on my writing. The first few days were peaceful. I spent most of my time indoors, unpacking and settling into the house. The cottage had a cozy warmth to it, despite the drafty windows and the creaking floors. The air was fresh, and the only sounds that filled it were the occasional rustle of wind through the trees or the soft call of distant birds. In the evenings, I would sit by the fireplace with a book, the glow of the flames casting shadows on the walls. But as the days passed, I began to notice small things. At first, it was easy to dismiss them as quirks of an old house. The occasional thud coming from the ceiling, the flickering lights, the faint scent of something musky that seemed to linger in the corners of the rooms. I told myself that it was just the house settling, or the old plumbing, or perhaps a breeze sneaking in through the cracks. But one evening, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I was sitting in the living room, writing, when I heard it, a low, persistent tapping noise. It came from upstairs, from the room above mine. I paused, listening, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I told myself it was probably just a branch tapping against the window or the wind causing something to shift. Still, the unease lingered. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard the tapping again. It was louder this time, like someone was gently knocking on the floor above me. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to remain calm. I climbed out of bed and made my way upstairs, the old wood creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, I found the hallway empty, the room at the end of the hall dark and still. The noise had stopped. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange. On the floor near the wall, barely visible in the dim light, was a small, shallow indentation in the wood, as though something had been dragged across it. I knelt down to inspect it more closely, but there was nothing there. No sign of anything that could have caused it. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I stood up and quickly walked back to my room. The following days were filled with a strange tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. At night, I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for any signs of movement. The tapping persisted, though it seemed to come and go without warning. Sometimes it would be soft, like distant footsteps. Other times it was sharp and insistent, as if someone were trying to get my attention. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to know what was causing the noise, so I began to search the house. I combed through the upstairs rooms, examining every corner, every piece of furniture. There was no sign of any intruders, no evidence of any hidden spaces or rooms. The house was as empty as it had been when I first moved in, yet the noise continued. One morning, as I was sitting at the kitchen table, I noticed something new, something I hadn't seen before. A small, rectangular shape carved into the wood of the table. It wasn't deep, but it was clear, as though someone had etched it there recently. The design was simple, a cross within a circle, with lines extending outward. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it, but nothing came to mind. It didn't seem like something that had been done carelessly. It was deliberate, as if it had been placed there for a reason. That night, after I had retired to bed, the tapping grew more pronounced. This time, it seemed to echo through the entire house, reverberating through the walls like a warning. I got up and made my way upstairs again, heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the room at the end of the hall, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. The door was open. I didn't remember leaving it open. I always closed it at night, yet there it was, wide ajar. The room was pitch dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the moon outside. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my weight, and immediately felt the temperature drop. It was cold in here, unnaturally so, and the air felt thick, as though something was pressing in on me from all sides. I took a step forward, my breath visible in the cool air. The room was empty, save for a single old-fashioned rocking chair in the corner. It was positioned facing the window, its back to the door. But what caught my attention wasn't the chair, it was what was on the floor beside it. The same symbol that had appeared on the table was now etched into the floorboards, as though someone had dragged something sharp across the wood. The lines were fresh, still jagged and deep, as if the carving had been done only moments before. I knelt down to get a better look, and as I did, I felt something behind me. The chair moved. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift, as though someone had nudged it. But then it rocked, slowly at first, then faster, creaking with each motion, as though an invisible force were pushing it back and forth. My heart raced, and the air around me seemed to tighten. I wanted to run, to leave the room, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The chair stopped suddenly, and for a long moment, there was only silence. But then the tapping started again, louder than ever, echoing through the room and shaking the walls. I looked around, panic rising in my chest, but there was nothing to see. No one was there. And then, in the stillness, I saw it. A shadow in the corner of the room, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. It shifted, moving closer, and for the first time since I had come to the house, I felt the unmistakable sensation that I was being watched. The shadow stopped at the foot of the bed, and just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't stay in the house after that night. I left the very next morning, barely packing my belongings, and drove back to the city. The cottage sat empty, its door left wide open behind me, as if it were waiting for me to return. The shadows that had followed me now seemed to linger in the corners of my mind, and the noise, the tapping, the creaking still echoed in my ears. I never went back to that place. But sometimes, when the house is quiet and I sit alone, I can still hear it, the faint tapping just out of reach, as though something is still trying to get my attention. The darkness is patient, after all, and some things are never truly left behind. Story 7. I had always thought that the countryside would offer a reprieve from the pressures of city life. It promised a simplicity that felt like a balm for the constant noise and rush. So, when the opportunity to rent a small house on the outskirts of town came up, I took it without hesitation. The house, an old Victorian with sagging walls and a neglected garden, stood at the end of a long, narrow road that led out of town and into the wilds of nature. It was isolated, just the way I wanted it. The first few weeks were pleasant. The air was fresh, the land around the house sprawling and green. The house itself, while run down, had a certain charm. The wooden floors creaked, and the wallpaper was peeling in some places, but it had a character that made it feel like home. I spent my days exploring the fields and the small woods that bordered the property, and I would return in the evenings to the warmth of the fireplace. The silence of the place was calming, the kind of quiet that felt like a welcome embrace. But as time passed, things began to change. The first indication was subtle, a quiet unease that settled in the corners of my mind. I began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. At night, the house would groan in strange ways. The floorboards would creak even when there was no one walking on them, and sometimes I could hear the faintest sounds, soft scraping, like nails dragging across wood. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that old houses just made noises, but the noises grew more distinct over time. One evening, as I was reading by the fire, I heard something unusual. It was a tapping, almost rhythmic, coming from upstairs. I paused, listening carefully. It wasn't the usual creaking of the house settling, but a sharp, consistent tapping, like something, or someone, was knocking on the floor above me. I stood up, slowly, and made my way up the stairs. The sound stopped as soon as I reached the landing. I checked the rooms one by one, but there was nothing amiss. No explanation for the noise. I returned downstairs, trying to push the strange feeling from my mind. But the house felt different now. The silence had thickened, and the air seemed heavier somehow, as if something was waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I found it harder to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, the tapping. It started again, as faint as a whisper at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to reverberate through the walls. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to drown out the sound, but it only seemed to grow stronger. My heart raced as I lay there, frozen in place, listening to the slow, deliberate tapping. The next morning, I woke to an empty house, the unsettling noises gone as quickly as they had appeared. I told myself it had just been my imagination, that I had been too tired, too stressed. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. Something had changed. I began to notice more oddities in the days that followed. The air around the house grew colder, even in the middle of the day. I would enter a room and find the temperature had dropped, the air thick with an unnatural chill. Sometimes, when I walked past a mirror, I would catch glimpses of movement in the reflection, a fleeting shadow, a flicker of something just out of view. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. No one. I tried to stay busy, to keep my mind occupied with the everyday tasks of living, cleaning, cooking, gardening. But even these small tasks felt like they were done in a haze. The house seemed to sap my energy, leaving me tired and on edge. At night, the tapping would return. It was always the same, soft at first, but then growing louder like a rhythmic pulse, as if something was trying to get through to me. One evening, after a particularly long and exhausting day, I decided to investigate further. I had to know what was causing the sounds. The house was old, yes, but it didn't explain the growing sense of dread I felt every time I stepped inside. I started with the attic. It was the one place in the house I hadn't explored thoroughly. The stairs to the attic were narrow and steep, the air thick with dust as I opened the door. The attic was dark, its only light coming from the small window at the far end. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, and old furniture sat covered in dusty sheets, as though abandoned in time. But as I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was dense, like a weight pressing down on me. I took a few tentative steps into the room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. And then I saw it. In the far corner, covered by a faded sheet, was an old rocking chair. It wasn't anything remarkable, just a wooden chair with a worn seat, but it caught my attention. I walked over to it, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, and pulled the sheet away. There was nothing unusual about the chair itself, but as I stood there staring at it, I heard it, the tapping. It came from beneath the floorboards, low and constant. At first, it was faint, but then it grew louder, reverberating through the room. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the floor. The tapping was coming from somewhere below, but the floor was solid. There was no obvious space beneath it. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. The sound stopped abruptly, and a sudden, unnatural silence filled the room. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. The attic, once a quiet and forgotten place, now felt oppressive. The air was thick, and the temperature had dropped again. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, as if they were pressing in on me. I turned to leave, but something made me pause. On the far wall, just behind the old rocking chair, there was something faint, like a faint impression on the wall. It wasn't a crack, but more like an indentation, almost as if something had been pressed into the wall over time. I walked over to it and placed my hand against the spot. It was cold to the touch, and when I moved my hand, I could feel a subtle vibration, like something alive was hidden behind it. I quickly stepped back and turned to leave, but just before I closed the attic door, I heard it again. A soft whisper, like the sound of wind moving through cracks, followed by a slow, deliberate tapping. The house had begun to feel alive, as if it were aware of my presence, watching, waiting. The following night, the tapping returned, louder than ever before. This time, it wasn't just from the floor. It came from the walls, the ceiling, from all around me. It was frantic now, as if something was desperately trying to communicate. I could hear it above the roaring of my own heartbeat, and I could feel it. Something shifting in the air, something old and dangerous, something that didn't belong. I spent the rest of the night pacing through the house, trying to escape the noise. It followed me, always just behind, always just out of reach. I locked the doors, but the tapping continued. It echoed through the hallways, moving closer and closer, until I couldn't tell if it was in my head or if it was real. I began to feel dizzy, disoriented, as if the house itself was warping around me. In the morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking. The house felt suffocating now, like a trap I couldn't escape. The tapping still rang in my ears, louder than ever, but when I looked around, there was no one there. I didn't look back as I left. I didn't care to. The cottage that had once seemed like a sanctuary was now a place of terror, its walls echoing with the sounds of something I could never understand. The road ahead was long, but the tapping had stopped. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house hadn't truly let me go. I could still hear it, faintly in the back of my mind. The rhythmic tapping, always waiting, always following, as if the house was calling me back. And I knew then that I would never truly escape. Story 8. The old mansion at the edge of town had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Overgrown ivy crept up its stone walls, and the windows, covered in grime and dust, stared out like dark eyes, lifeless and hollow. People spoke of it in hushed tones, always avoiding it when walking down the street, as though the house itself was cursed. But for some reason I was drawn to it. I had lived in the town for several years, and although I had heard the whispers about the mansion, I had never thought much of them. It was just another old building, another relic of a past long forgotten. But one evening, as I walked home from the local store, I found myself standing at the gate of the mansion, staring up at its dark silhouette against the fading twilight. There was something about the place that seemed to call to me. Maybe it was the stillness, the quiet that hung around it like a heavy fog. Or perhaps it was the strange feeling that settled in my chest whenever I thought about it, the sense that something was hidden within those walls, something waiting. The gate, which had once been locked tight, was now slightly ajar. Without thinking, I pushed it open and stepped onto the overgrown path that led to the front door. The garden was wild, with weeds and tall grass overtaking the once pristine flower beds. The mansion loomed ahead, dark and imposing, its broken windows like eyes watching my every movement. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled by the thick grass. The door, though weathered and splintered, was still intact, and it creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, the musty smell of age and decay hanging heavy in the silence. Dust coated every surface, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as I ventured deeper into the house. The grand hallway stretched before me, its walls lined with faded wallpaper that peeled away in places, exposing the dark wood beneath. The light from the setting sun filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The place felt abandoned, yet there was an unsettling sense of life about it, as though it hadn't been completely forsaken. The silence was suffocating, oppressive. I moved through the house, exploring room by room. Each one was in a similar state, neglected, untouched for years. But there was something strange about the way the house seemed to hold its own memories, as if the air itself was thick with forgotten voices and long-lost moments. I passed through the kitchen, where old pots and pans lay scattered across the floor, their handles rusted and their surfaces covered in dust. The once functional fireplace in the living room was now a blackened, empty space. But in the far corner of the room, something caught my eye. It was a chair. A simple wooden chair, its seat cracked and worn with age. It stood alone in the center of the room, facing away from the hearth, as if it had been left there for someone to return to. I couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward it, as though it were calling me. I stepped closer, my hand hovering over the back of the chair, but something stopped me. The room felt colder now, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in the time I had been inside. I pulled my hand back quickly and turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something on the wall behind the chair. It was a painting. The frame was cracked, the glass broken, but the image beneath was still clear enough to make out. A family, standing together, their faces solemn and composed, as though they had been frozen in time. The man at the center of the painting was tall, with dark eyes and a severe expression. The woman beside him was delicate, her face soft but distant, and between them stood two children, a boy and a girl, their faces pale and expressionless. I stared at the painting for a long time, drawn to the stillness of their faces, the emptiness in their eyes. Something about them seemed wrong, unnatural. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, that they were somehow aware of my presence. I turned away, my mind racing. I hadn't meant to linger here. I had only come to explore, but now I wanted to leave. I headed toward the door, but the house seemed to have changed. The hallway stretched on longer than before, the shadows in the corners deeper, as if the house itself were shifting. I glanced back, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway behind me, but there was no one there. Just the same empty darkness. I reached the front door, but as I stepped out onto the porch, I froze. A figure stood at the edge of the garden, just beyond the overgrown shrubs. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel his presence, a weight in the air, like the atmosphere had thickened around him. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me. For a moment, I felt rooted to the spot. A strange compulsion filled me, as though I should go toward him, as though I had no choice but to approach. But then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished into the darkness of the garden. I stood there for several moments, staring into the night. The house behind me seemed even darker now, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for me to make my next move. I didn't know what had just happened. Had I imagined it? The figure, the strange pull I felt toward him. It all felt surreal, as if I had stumbled into some otherworldly place. I didn't wait to find out. My legs carried me back down the path, and I didn't look back until I reached the gate. When I glanced over my shoulder, the mansion stood silent in the distance, its windows dark and empty. The house had returned to its stillness, and I was left with nothing but the lingering sense that I had seen something I was never meant to see. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the mansion. The house called to me, even though I knew I should stay away. It felt like an obsession, this need to return. The image of the family in the painting, the man in the garden, it all stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I tried to shake it off, to move on with my life, but each time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, their hollow, watchful eyes, staring at me from the walls of the mansion. I returned to the house that same week, driven by an urge I couldn't explain. The gate was still open, the path still overgrown, but this time, the air felt different. It was heavier, thicker with something unspoken. As I stepped through the door, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, as though something inside had been disturbed by my presence. The silence was more oppressive than before, the shadows deeper, the cold more biting. I made my way through the house once more, but this time, everything felt wrong. The air seemed to grow colder with every step I took, the walls seemed to close in, and the floorboards creaked under my weight, but with a deeper, more deliberate sound. I reached the living room again, the same chair sitting in the center of the room, waiting. But now, the painting was different. The faces of the family had changed. The expressions on their faces were no longer solemn or distant. They were filled with fear. The eyes of the children, once empty, now seemed to follow me, and the man at the center of the painting stared at me with an expression of intense, unyielding hatred. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't right. Something had happened in the time I had been away. Something had shifted in the house. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked from the inside, as if the house itself were keeping me there. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching longer, darker. I turned back to the painting, my heart pounding in my chest. The faces of the family were now twisted, contorted with an expression of terror. I could feel their eyes on me, could feel them reaching out, calling to me. The tapping started again, but this time it was louder, closer, coming from behind the walls. I reached for the door again, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder still, and the tapping grew louder, until it seemed to fill the entire room. And then, in the stillness, I heard something else. A voice, soft but unmistakable, whispering from within the house itself. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, my heart racing, the sound of the tapping following me, echoing in my ears. I pushed through the door, finally breaking free into the night. The mansion stood silent behind me, its windows dark and unblinking. But I knew then that I would never escape its call. The mansion still stands at the edge of town, abandoned, forgotten. But every night, when the wind blows just right, I hear the tapping. And I know that whatever is inside that house, whatever has been waiting, is still there, waiting for someone else to come. Story 9. The village of Hallowbrook was quiet, so quiet that it almost felt as though time itself had forgotten it. The houses were old, with dark brick walls and overgrown gardens, and the roads, though paved, were cracked and uneven, as though they had long ago been left behind by the world. I had only recently moved here, after taking a job as a historian at the local museum. It seemed like the perfect place to escape the noise of the city and settle into a life of peace and reflection. The people of Hallowbrook were a curious lot. They were polite, of course, but distant. When I first arrived, I was greeted with a few polite nods and the occasional good morning, but that was about it. They went about their routines, and I went about mine, and we never crossed paths much outside of the necessary interactions at the museum. But there was something unsettling about the town. It was the kind of place that felt stuck in time. People didn't change, and nothing ever seemed to happen. I had been living there for nearly a month when I first began to notice the odd things. It started small, things I could easily chalk up to the quirks of an old house. A door that wouldn't quite shut, an object that had shifted on its own, faint sounds in the night that I couldn't explain. But then, as time wore on, the occurrences grew more frequent, more distinct, until they could no longer be dismissed. I had rented an old cottage on the outskirts of the village. It was a small building, tucked behind an overgrown hedge and surrounded by trees. The cottage had once been a charming little home, but now it was weathered and tired. The paint had peeled from the windowsills, the roof sagged in places, and the front porch creaked with every step. Still, it was affordable, and it had a quiet, solitary charm that I had come to appreciate. I spent my days at the museum, and my evenings at the cottage, where I would read or write, enjoying the silence of my solitude. But at night, the silence was broken. It started with the footsteps. At first, I thought I was hearing things, the sounds of my imagination playing tricks on me after a long day. But then, I would hear them again. Soft, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor above me. I would pause, listening, but when I would go upstairs, there would be no sign of anyone. The house was empty, and yet the sounds continued. It was always the same, slow, deliberate steps, followed by a brief silence before the pattern would repeat itself. I couldn't understand it. The house was old, but it had been empty for years before I moved in. No one had lived there in a long time, and yet I felt the unmistakable sensation that someone else was in the house with me. I couldn't explain it, but every time I heard those footsteps, my skin would crawl. It wasn't just the footsteps. Over time, I began to notice other things. At night, I would hear the sound of something dragging across the floor, faint but constant, as though something was moving through the rooms, unseen. I would sometimes hear a low humming sound coming from the attic, something faint but persistent, as though it were just out of reach. The house felt as though it were alive, breathing, shifting, always watching. One evening, after a particularly long day at the museum, I returned to the cottage, weary and eager for some rest. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it, the shift in the air. It was as if the house itself had grown colder, more oppressive. I dropped my bag by the door and went into the living room. The place felt wrong. The furniture, though untouched, seemed to have shifted ever so slightly, as if someone had been there, moving things around. I didn't stay long in the living room. The air was too heavy, too thick, and I felt an undeniable urge to go upstairs, to check the rooms, to make sure I wasn't imagining things. As I walked up the creaking staircase, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The temperature had dropped, and the faint smell of something old and musty filled the air. The footsteps began again, faint at first, but growing louder, closer, as if whatever was in the house with me was now making its way toward the stairs. I reached the top of the stairs, and the noise stopped abruptly. I looked down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The floor was dimly lit by the fading light outside, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. The hallway was empty, but it felt as though someone, or something, was standing just out of sight, watching me. I pushed the door to the first room open, but there was nothing there. No one. I moved to the next room, then the next, but the rooms were all empty, their dusty furniture undisturbed. And yet, the feeling that I wasn't alone persisted. It was then that I noticed something strange. There, on the floor in the farthest room, near the window, was a small, faint mark, a line scratched into the wood. I knelt down, my fingers brushing the surface, and as I did, I felt the unmistakable sensation of something cold and wet beneath my fingertips. I pulled my hand back quickly, but the feeling lingered in my mind, unsettling and inexplicable. The next few days passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on my work at the museum. My thoughts were consumed by the strange happenings in the cottage. The footsteps continued every night, and I started to notice other things as well. Sometimes, when I passed by a mirror, I would catch a glimpse of something behind me, an indistinct shadow, a figure that vanished as soon as I turned to look. And at night, the humming grew louder, more insistent, as though something was trying to get my attention from above, from the attic. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind, but deep down, I knew something was wrong with the house. The feeling of being watched was too strong, too persistent to ignore. I couldn't stay there any longer. But every time I thought about leaving, I was drawn back. The house had a hold on me, a pull that I couldn't explain. One evening, after another night of restless sleep, I decided I had to confront whatever it was that haunted the house. I couldn't live in fear anymore. I had to know the truth. I gathered my courage and made my way to the attic. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I climbed, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder the closer I got to the top, and by the time I reached the attic door, I could see my breath in the air. I opened the door slowly, and the smell hit me immediately. Mold, dust, and something else, something faint but unmistakable. The attic was empty, save for a few old boxes and discarded furniture. But in the center of the room, there was something else. A large, dark stain on the floor. It was nearly impossible to see in the dim light, but as I stepped closer, I realized what it was. It was blood. The blood had dried long ago, but the stain was unmistakable. I could feel the weight of the room pressing in on me, and as I stood there, the tapping began again, louder this time, as though something was trying to break through the walls. I didn't know what to do. The air was thick with dread, and I could feel the temperature drop even further. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, as though they were alive, creeping closer. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. The footsteps started again, faster now, as though something was running toward me. The walls seemed to close in, and I could feel the presence of something unseen, something ancient and malevolent, filling the room. My heart raced, and panic surged through me. I pounded on the door, but it wouldn't open. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, until I felt something cold brush against my shoulder. I turned, but there was nothing there. Only the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the noise stopped. The air grew still, and the door creaked open on its own. I didn't hesitate. I ran out of the attic, down the stairs, and out of the cottage. The night air was cold, but it felt like freedom. I didn't look back as I walked away, but I could feel the house behind me, watching, waiting. I left Hallowbrook the next morning, unable to explain what had happened in that cottage. The village remained as quiet and still as ever, but I knew that the house, the presence in that place, had a hold on it. And I also knew that whatever it was, whatever was haunting that old house, would never let me go. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the footsteps, the shadows, the whispers, none of it was truly gone. The house had simply found a new place to wait. Story 10. The town of Westmore had always been known for its quiet simplicity. Nestled between two rolling hills and surrounded by dense forests, it had the kind of peace that drew people in, offering a kind of refuge from the busy world beyond. Its cobblestone streets, shaded by tall trees, led to quaint homes with old brick walls, their chimneys puffing out thin plumes of smoke that lingered in the crisp evening air. I moved to Westmore in search of solitude, having grown weary of the constant rush of city life. The village was small, the people polite, but reserved. It felt like a place where time moved slowly, almost imperceptibly. I rented an old farmhouse on the edge of the village. The property was vast, the house spacious and worn, but it had a charm to it. The front porch creaked when you walked on it, and the windows were old and fogged with age, but it felt comfortable, like a place I could finally breathe. At first, the house was everything I needed. I spent my days working in the small study I had set up in the back room, writing and reading, with the occasional walk through the surrounding woods. The air was fresh, the sounds of nature soothing. I spent hours in the quiet, the kind of stillness that only places like this could offer. But soon, something began to shift in the house. At first, I noticed it only at night, a low humming sound, almost imperceptible, that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was soft, just loud enough to make me question whether I was hearing things, but every time I tried to ignore it, it persisted. Some nights, it felt like the sound would crescendo, growing louder, until I had to stop whatever I was doing and listen. But when I tried to find its source, the house was always still, its shadows deep and impenetrable. The humming would stop as suddenly as it had started. I tried to shake off the odd sensation, telling myself it was just the quirks of an old house settling. But then there were the footsteps. They started faintly at first, a soft tapping, like shoes moving across the floor of the upstairs hallway. I would pause, listening for a moment, expecting to hear something or someone moving in the next room, but there was never anyone there. The footsteps continued every night. Each time, they grew a little louder, a little closer, until I could almost feel the vibrations in the floor beneath me. The house seemed to be full of these little sounds, the creak of floorboards, the subtle shift of the old wooden beams, and the ever-present humming. But it wasn't the noises themselves that unnerved me. It was the feeling of presence, the sensation that someone was in the house with me, walking through the rooms, even though I knew I was alone. I began to wonder if I was imagining things. The town had a history, of course. Many of the houses in the village had been around for generations, built long before modern comforts had arrived. People often spoke of the old houses in the area, claiming they held memories of past lives, of families long gone. Some said that the old farms were haunted, that the land itself was marked by history, both good and bad. But I had never been one to believe in such things. I had always found comfort in the idea that what you saw with your eyes was all there was. It was the second month in the house when things began to escalate. One evening, after a long day of writing, I decided to take a walk around the property. The sky was clouded over, and the air had the sharp, cool bite of impending rain. The fields behind the house were lush with overgrown grass, the wildflowers dancing in the breeze. The woods, dark and silent, stood at the edge of the property, as imposing as they were inviting. I wandered into the woods, losing myself in the tranquility of nature, but even in the open air, I couldn't shake the sense of something watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt an increasing urgency to return to the house. I turned back toward the farmhouse, walking quickly now, the hairs on my skin prickling. When I reached the house, the door was ajar. I stopped in my tracks. I was certain I had closed it before leaving. I stood there for a moment, staring at the gap between the doorframe, my heart racing in my chest. The farmhouse was quiet, too quiet. I stepped inside, the familiar smell of old wood and dust filling my senses. The front hall was empty, but as I stepped further into the house, I could feel the air grow colder. The humming started again, louder this time, resonating through the walls. It was no longer just a faint background noise. It was an oppressive, vibrating hum that seemed to fill the entire house. The sound was coming from upstairs. The footsteps followed. I froze, standing still in the hall. The sound of heavy footsteps moved across the floor above me, slow and deliberate. I glanced up the staircase, but I could see nothing in the shadows above. The air around me seemed to grow denser, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. My heart was pounding in my chest as I slowly moved toward the staircase. I was no longer certain that I was alone in the house. I ascended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, my ears straining for any sound. The humming had grown louder, more pronounced. The footsteps were closer now, almost at the top of the stairs. I reached the landing and moved down the hallway toward the room at the far end, where the sound seemed to be the strongest. The door to the room was closed, but I could see a faint light flickering from underneath. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling, and turned it. The door opened with an unsettling groan. The room was empty. There was nothing there, no figure, no presence. But the humming had stopped. In its place, I could hear something else, scratching. It was coming from the wall. My eyes darted around the room, but the walls were smooth, undisturbed. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but I couldn't move. I stood frozen, staring at the bare walls. The scratching continued, slow and methodical. It wasn't loud, but it was there, insistent. It was coming from behind the wall. I backed out of the room, closing the door gently behind me, but the scratching didn't stop. It followed me down the hallway, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me, scraping, clawing at the wood, at the plaster. I fled down the stairs, my breath coming in short gasps. The house seemed to pulse with the noise, as though the walls themselves were alive, reacting to my fear. The door was still ajar. I didn't hesitate this time. I ran out of the house, across the yard, and into the woods, not stopping until I had put the farmhouse behind me. The scratching, the humming, the footsteps, they all seemed to follow me, lingering in my mind, echoing in my ears. I didn't return that night, or the next. I stayed in the small village, renting a room at the inn, but even there, I couldn't escape the sensation that I wasn't alone. The quiet seemed unnatural, as though something was waiting for me to go back. The footsteps followed me in my dreams, and the scratching never stopped. A few days later, I returned to the farmhouse to gather my things, unsure of what I hoped to find. I told myself I was being irrational, that I had imagined everything, the sounds, the feeling of being watched, the strange coldness in the house. I opened the door, and it was as if nothing had changed. The house was still and silent, its shadows deepening as the sun set. I went upstairs, the footsteps no longer following, the humming gone. The room at the end of the hallway stood before me, its door ajar, just as I had left it. I stepped inside, and this time, the scratching was gone. The room was empty, the walls undisturbed. There was nothing there. I closed the door and left the house for good. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been watching me all along. And though I had left, the scratching, the humming, and the footsteps, they would never leave my mind. It was as though the house had imprinted itself on me, its presence forever lingering, waiting for me to return.